Hey guys, welcome back.
Hello.
So how are you guys doing with the heat?
Well, not so good. It's like an oven or something. It's way too hot.
Yeah, I agree. I'm literally melting here on this chair. But that won't stop us from making progress. So speaking of which, I have been working on Elsa this week. Nothing to show, just promises of cool things to come. Specifically, what I've been working on is the ability to create custom activities using the designer that you can then reuse. So you'll be able to create a little flowchart activities. They are like composite activities in Elsa 2, but this in Elsa 3 you will be able to create them using the designer and then they will become available in the toolbox. It required a bit of refactoring to make things more modular from the designer's point of view so that I can reuse the designer, for example. So there's that. I've also been working on making the APIs more modular, specifically when it comes to customizing the authorization using policies and permissions and claims. And I think I want to show you a little bit of what I'm using there just to get your opinion on the direction. And of course, if anyone has any additional topics they would like to discuss, let me know.
Yeah, I have some questions regarding the transient. I was working on that today, and I don't fully get how it works and what I should expect actually. Maybe we can revisit that topic again.
Can you repeat that question? You mean transient status or
Yeah,
storage?
I'm having an workflow which handles a big blob of data, and I have to do it in different activities to handle it. But now the whole activity data in the workflow instance gets too big. While I really don't need it, because as I looked into the documentation, it said transient is yeah, store it, but don't cry if it gets lost when something happens, and that's fine for me. But I can't get it to work that the data is getting minimized or less big.
Okay, yeah, sure. We can take a look at that.
And I've been looking into discussion of last week with Parallel. Didn't come to the final conclusions. I looked into another engine, Camunda, and BPMN, how they do it. Yeah, I think you can't escape having explicit fork and join to make it all happen.
Okay, yeah, let's go over
But
that as well.
yeah,
Great. Do you want to start with that, or would you like to go through the updates first?
I'd rather go through the update so I can think about how I can explain it properly.
Yeah, sure, got it. All right. So let me start with the API endpoints. So as part of this new feature that I'm working on with the custom activities, it needs its own little backend. I'm implementing it as a separate module. So just to show you, there's the modules, and here's the custom activities module. And it has a bunch of endpoints to manage activity definitions. And an activity definition is like a workflow definition where it stores activities and connections between them. So it's at the root, it's a flowchart. And for that, you need to be able to persist workflow definition, activity definitions and read them, of course, and update them. But the tricky part that we have with Elsa 2 is how do we allow users of the Elsa library to control authorization and authentication. And of course, ASP.NET Core has a lot of APIs built in that we can use and that we can leverage. But some applications may need more granular control over what API endpoints are accessible and which aren't. The most simplistic case, of course, is a user needs to be authenticated and maybe assigned a specific role, or maybe some policy needs to be evaluated to check if a user has authorization to invoke a given endpoint. But to get this more granular, we need something more dynamic because we can't be too opinionated. At the same time, we need to allow users to make customizations. So what I found was a little library called Fast Endpoints. And then you ask, what is Fast Endpoints? That is a lightweight REST API framework for ASP.NET 6. And the nice thing about this is that it literally lets you implement endpoints in the most simplest of ways. So I've already started this pattern with the existing API endpoints. So here, for example, we have, not this one, that's the wrong example here. For example, we have the workflow definitions endpoints, and each class here is a controller. But the pattern I'm employing here is every controller represents a single endpoint. So that means every controller has a single action, and that works fine. But in order to implement things like authorization using policies or role names, one has to use the authorized attribute. But this, of course, is very static. So what we could do is just provide some policy name and then add some documentation where it it's up to the user to implement the policy in the startup class. But then it becomes a little bit tricky to give the user more flexibility. And I'm not sure we need to give that level of flexibility, but at the very least, we need to provide some security mechanisms. But fast endpoints allows us to do it a little bit differently, more dynamically. And also the fact that it implements this pattern where you have one action per endpoint is what I really like. So what does that look like? So for example, here we have a resource called activity definitions, and then we have a bunch of operations on that. So for example, to get an activity definition, you implement class called, or you derive your class from an endpoint base class. You specify the request type and the response type if you have any, and then you implement a single method that implements your endpoint basically. So here I'm just loading the activity definition being requested using a definition ID route parameter from the store, and then I return it. So it's very straightforward. But look at the configure method here. Here we can specify the route as you can do with controllers, specify the verbs. Actually, this can be done a little bit simpler like this. But what you also can do is specify things like policies. So you can, this is similar to the authorized attributes where you specify a policy name, but here you can specify multiple. And they also implement a permissions feature. So basically what they rely on is storing a list of feature or permissions in a claim of the token. If you're using bearer authentication, you don't have to use that, of course, but it's very convenient because this way we can have per endpoint have a set of permissions that the user needs to have. Could be any of the specified permissions in this list, or you can configure this to require all specified permissions using the permissions all. But let's say for this endpoint, the user needs the get activity definition permission. So just like this will be a name. And then what we can do is have a default token endpoint that allows you to create a bearer token with a bunch of permissions for a user. So this way, the user of the Elsa framework can make a very advanced, fine-grained user management screen if they wanted to, and give precise permissions to a user. Of course, most other users will not need that level of granularity, so they will probably just want to say, well, in order to access the Elsa API endpoints, the user needs to be authenticated and maybe also be of a certain role, and that's it. So that is something I want to support as well.
What is the default approach? Any or all?
So by default, no permissions are required, but the
Oh,
all
but for the setting for the controllers that you're gonna implement, then you have to make a decision, right?
Come again?
Well, for the activities that you or the endpoints that you are gonna create, you have to decide what kind of permissions you're gonna set on those. Are you gonna set permissions for permissions all or permissions any?
Exactly.
And which names are you gonna use? So.
Yeah, perfect question. So let me show you what I'm doing here. So as to answer that question, let's take a look at the get endpoint, or actually this should be named list. So this endpoint will return a list of activity definitions. And here I'm starting to experiment with that, exactly that question. What name do you use? And do you even need to require a list of permissions? So what I did here, I created a base class called protected endpoint, which looks like this. And then what it's doing, it's using a static class called API security options that lets the user of the Elsa framework configure their preferences. So they could allow anonymous access using a single flag, and that would be it. The user would not have to care about permissions, policies, or roles. Or if they do care about that, they can choose whether they want to just use role names and not be bothered with policies or permissions, or use permissions or policies, or all of them, although using all of them probably doesn't make much sense. Maybe for some endpoints it makes sense, maybe not for others. Generally, probably the user will pick one strategy and go with that. So for this list specific endpoint, I'm using the list activity definitions permissions. That looks like this. So here I have a constants class in this folder that also hosts the endpoint. And I basically provide a name for all three strategies that the user can use. So if the user wants to require the user to meet a certain policy requirement, then this is the policy name. So that means the user will have, from the startup class, they will have to configure a policy by this name, and they can configure it to be anonymous or require authentication or have a set of claims etc. So it will be up to the user. And this way they can do it on a per endpoint level. Probably won't happen in practice, but you never know.
Okay, cool. But using a static for this one, are we already thinking about multi-tenancy and so on? Because that's going to be a challenge then.
I have not thought about multi-tenancy at all.
Okay.
Okay, how about setting permissions on individual workflows? Will this allow, for example, that for an individual workflow, I want to set different permissions than other workflows?
Yeah, so that's a different story and requires a different strategy probably because workflows that represent an API or an endpoint, an HTTP endpoint, are not implemented using these fast endpoints libraries. So that will be done through some middleware. So we need a different solution for that. And that's out of scope for this particular piece, but it's a very important topic as well to implement, but as a separate task.
And how will these permissions reflect on the dashboard? So will it hide the actions that the user cannot perform, or how it will behave in that case?
So currently I'm not going to expose any UI to let the user configure users. We could do it as a users or a security module, but it's not required. So the developer can just configure security from the startup, and then it's up to them if they want to issue tokens, access tokens, if they want to use JWT security or if they want to use Active Directory security. That's up to the implementer. Ultimately, this is just about the user principle, and how
So
the principle is established is out of scope for now for this.
Yeah, but in case, for example, a certain user has a permission only to read the workflow definition, but they are not allowed to edit. So in that case, in the dashboard, it will let them see, but not edit.
Oh, I see.
The edit button will be hidden.
Yeah, good point. So I haven't thought of that at this point. So currently what would happen, the dashboard will just show all of the available options and disregard the authentication in place, which means, of course, if the user has a token that does not have the necessary permission, then that API call will fail because it will be forbidden or unauthorized. But it's a good point.
Yeah,
So
because,
we need a solution for that as well. The UI needs to
yeah,
reflect the current user's permissions.
yeah, because even now in Elsa 2, we can just write one big handler that, can try to take care of all the authorization. But the problem in the dashboard, without customization, all the actions are available and the user will be just faced with lots of errors
Yeah,
when
exactly.
trying to do the action.
Yeah, so one solution could be for the front end to read the token. Of course, this assumes that we will use access tokens following the JWT standard or the JWT standard so that we can read the claims. And then based on the claims, one claim will be a set of permissions. So we could read the set of permissions or the roles or the policies. Of course, the policies doesn't make sense on the client side because the implementation depends on whatever the developer chose to on the server side. So that requires some more thinking.
That library that you chose, because this issue is normally handled by HUS, which is the fourth level of RESTful API, which basically wraps content back into an envelope and having all the allowed method on that resource as metadata in it. And that's the normal way I do it usually, to have that separation in the UI and the rights of the backend to be synchronized.
Ah, that's interesting. So maybe we can explore that a little bit to see how that might work. I'm not familiar with the ATAS, but I've heard of it, never used it, but it sounds good.
Yeah. Another question would be, because I was looking into an issue of Elsa 2, where the workflow instances in the UI get really slow because of the data is really big, and it is not in the list, it's not necessary. Do we implement data shaping on the endpoints? That you could say only those fields I'm interested in?
To a certain extent right now. Ideally, we use something like GraphQL to do so. For now, for example, the workflow definitions returns a list of workflow definition summaries. So just a small version of important fields that's used for the definition browser, for example. And in that window, obviously doesn't need the actual data of the workflow definition. So for example, here we have the list endpoint for workflow definitions. And here, as you can see, it's gonna get a list of definition summaries. In Elsa 2, we have that as well. It only returns a smaller shape of a workflow definition, but the problem there is it's getting the full object, the full record from the database, so it's kind of useless. It saves a bit of bandwidth, but it's still quite slow, relatively speaking, to get the entire set of data from or page of workflow definitions. But here it's done the right way, I think. It's just getting the workflow definition summary from the query.
Yeah,
So,
because
so
the
this will cost to only the fields that you're interested in. So this will exclude the data column, for example.
oh, that's a nice, interesting way to do that. I never saw that. That's a smart way. The workflow definition summary, and then have that list of elements.
Yeah,
Cool.
it's nice. Yeah.
But basically, it's already implemented in Elsa 2, but it's done differently because the bottleneck is not the bandwidth from the server to the client, but basically fetching it from the database.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So here
Okay.
it's solved because it's only getting the fields it needs, but in Elsa 2 it gets the full object, including the data column, which can be quite big.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, these fast endpoints, I really like them. They're very modular, it seems, and they are fully featured. So they support Swagger, even request throttling, which is also now supported by ASP.NET Core, I think. But rate limiting, yeah, that's now supported. But all the important stuff is there. It's an interesting approach, and also it doesn't have to it doesn't interfere with other applications that use regular ASP.NET MVC and API controllers. It's just it's implemented using its own little middleware, so it can I think it can work nicely side by side. In fact, it's already working side by side because the current modules, the workflow core module, which exposes a bunch of API endpoints, is our regular API controllers, but then the activity definitions module uses fast endpoints. And yeah, works nicely. But it's not yet done. It's still work in progress. So yeah, so that's one thing I've been working on. So also taking security into account. The other thing is the designer for the activity definition. So the way it's going to work is from designer, you should be able to create a new activity definition next to workflow definition. And then you will see this designer. It will look pretty much the same, right? So there will be a toolbox of activities that you can add to the canvas. There will be the property panel will be here. And to the right, currently we're seeing the properties of the workflow definition, but this will be the activity definition. So it will be like a workflow, but presented to other workflows as an activity. So what you will start to see here at some point will be custom activities, for example, as a category, and that will list your created activities that you created using the designer. And of course, it integrates nicely with coded activities, which also supports composite activity. But to make this work, I had to do some refactoring so that this canvas, this designer, is reusable. It was too thin, if you will, so it did too little, and there was a lot of code duplication from the workflow definition editor. So let me just show you the composition actually. So the canvas is implemented as a component called flowchart. So this represents the flowchart activity with the editor. So that basically uses the X6 diagramming library. So that's very low level compared to the other primitives of Elsa. And then this component, the flowchart component, is wrapped by a component called the workflow definition editor. But it's also wrapped by the workflow instance editor and soon to be wrapped also by the activity definition editor. But there was a lot of code handling or handling of the hierarchy of the workflow. And by hierarchy, I mean, you see this little breadcrumb here. If I add this one here and then click on the plus, you see now we are in a lower level, if you will, of the hierarchy of this workflow. But this handling was implemented as part of the workflow definition editor component, which means it has to be duplicated to the workflow instance editor component and the activity definition editor, which is now good. So it's moved to a lower level, so to the flowchart component, so that it's automatically implemented when I use activity definition editor component. So that's one big refactoring, and another is to create more a modular architecture so that so that this system is easily extensible with other stencil components. And these modules allow you to control what button is displayed in the toolbar, for example, what menu items are displayed here, what happens when you click on those menu items, and everything nicely packaged in a single module. So that's what I'm currently working on. Once that's refactored, we will start seeing activity definitions, the ability to manage them, create them, and then use them. And at that point, I think we're very far ahead with the roadmap for Elsa 3. So just to show you the structure a little bit. So we still have components. These will be primitives, if you will. And then here are the modules. And by packaging these things in separate modules allows the implementer or the developer to control what features they want to enable and which ones they do not want to include. For example, the label management module, maybe some users don't want to use it. Or maybe people don't want to use notifications, although it's unlikely they don't want to use it, but it's at least it's an option this way. And it's also a nice way to flesh out the modular architecture, because the real value, of course, comes from developers wanting to add their own application-specific modules to the system. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. Any questions about that?
For the activity designer, then how do you specify the properties for the custom activity and outputs?
That's a
Because
great question.
if I want to use it in my workflow, then it has to have its own properties editor and all of that. So how we will define it here?
So my thinking was to do it through variables, where you can specify basically three types of variables. There will be input variables, output variables, and variables that are private to the workflow. And then what will happen is, for example, if you provide a variable that is marked as an output, then that will be available when this workflow is executed as an activity in some other workflow. The same goes for input. So you can specify or define a bunch of input variables. So let's say this is a custom activity, and then here I say, let's say this is a send email activity. And then as an input, I want the recipient address, for example, of type string, right? So this will then become, now imagine I will add this custom activity to another workflow and I select that activity. Then here at the bottom, you will see underneath settings, you will see recipient address and an input field into which you can provide some expression or some value.
But normally with the properties also, we need to select the supported syntaxes, options providers, or these things also we need to also map it, I think.
Yeah, good point. I haven't thought that far ahead actually to allow for that, but it's important at the very least to be able to specify as a user what JavaScript expression to use, but maybe some variables you shouldn't be able to use JavaScript expressions or not, or liquid, or maybe it needs to be configurable. Yeah. And in that case, maybe variables isn't the best way because variables should just be a name and a value, and that's it. So maybe we need a separate mechanism to allow the user to configure these input and output properties so that you can also include that metadata you just mentioned. Yeah, good point. So let me take a quick note about that. All right, should we move on to the transient data / storage?
Yeah, I was just wondering what is the intent of the attributes and how should I use it in a workflow to make the data footprint in the workflow instance as small as possible? Because I think that was the intent of the transient.
Exactly. Transient means the value exists just in memory, and as soon as the activity is done executing, that memory goes away. That's the idea.
The workflow is executed, not activity, I guess.
Kind of depends on the transient provider, but let's take a quick look. It's possible that it's indeed remains as long as the workflow definition is executing. That's indeed possible.
Because otherwise, if the activity is executed and it's done and it produces an output, then you can't access it and it's useless basically.
Yeah, that was stupid. Yeah, true. So yeah, that's how it works. But let me just set up a small example, and then maybe we can identify what your
code.
You want to do it from code.
Yeah, not using the designer, but just from code. So I usually do it by code, and sometimes I'm quite challenged by when I do it in the designer, how do I can translate it back to code.
Yeah, I've heard that before, actually. Just checking to see if there's already an example we can start from. I think I'm gonna create a new one once it's loaded. All right. Nope, not yet. So you are working with long-running workflows, although maybe it doesn't matter if this gets stored in a database, then we can inspect the workflow instance. Let's see. Maybe we can make this one work. So maybe we can configure this to use SQLite, and then we can inspect the workflow instance and make sure that the use variables and input and output isn't stored.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if this one works. So let's do an inspection on the workflow definition or the instance and see what actually is part of the instance and see if we can change it so that it doesn't get stored as part of the workflow instance. Well, it doesn't store that much. Okay, so maybe we'll see if we can change the workflow a little bit to try and simulate what is happening in your case.
Because the write line should be there, right? The hello should be in the, and that variable should be there.
Yeah, indeed. So set variable.
Is this big? Yeah, but the set variable, there has two options. You can set it set transient variable, but it's not because it defaults transient now.
No, I don't think so. That will break everyone.
And maybe you have set it somewhere as the default for everything, like in the setup or something that you...
I think the workflow didn't complete because it was asking to read from the file and then delete the file.
Oh, maybe. Let's try.
But still, then the first part should be there.
Well, so this workflow completes from start to finish, even though it does a read line, but that doesn't cause the workflow to be persistent. Oh, that's true. I didn't finish the workflow. Now it's finished. So this is the output of activity 2, and the variable should be here. So it's, well, stored temp file.
Yeah.
All right, so now let's say we don't want to store the output of temp file, because temp file stored its output, I think.
And that was activity 2, right? The test there. Yeah. If you don't want to have that one, for instance, in the
read line. Okay, so for that we should be able to say transient. Nope.
Is it with, it's something like with storage or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. So, okay, so this is workflow builder. Okay, so it's an extension on the setup activity, and this read line doesn't expose its setup. So in this case, we would do like this. And then this extension method lets you configure what property you want to store transiently. So in this case, that will be output. Let's give this a try.
By doing so, you're basically telling it not to store it in the activity, and while it is in the execution burst, you can still access it with, for instance, context get name activity property async.
That's the idea, indeed.
Yeah, okay.
So there's no more activity 2, at least not at the start. Oh, here's activity 2, output. So this is still stored.
Yeah, that was what I also experienced. I don't
think that's supposed to happen, be an oversight. I don't think this is supposed to happen, because if this returns a file, for example, you don't want the file contents to be stored.
Do you need to set up something for the transient provider?
I don't think so. I think this should have just worked. But clearly, not in this case. Well, this is not invoked.
Basically, the attribute setting, if you have a custom activity set the attribute on top of the property, it should have the same behavior with the transient. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe we can try that in the, see if it behaves differently if we put it here.
And now, this is also what I noticed, that after that, when you do that, it yields null, or it can't retrieve it anymore. Either it gets not saved, or is saved, but you can't fetch it anymore.
Yeah, indeed. It's,
but then
it's a bug.
Yeah, then I will create an issue for that, but then I know for sure that I did it the right way and didn't overlook anything.
Yeah, and there seems to be two issues, because changing the attribute to using the transient workflow storage provider by default looks like that will actually make the engine use it, this provider, but then when it's used, it errors out here. So that's so it's two issues, because this is another issue, that this does not seem to have the expected effect, because if this were taken into effect, then I would have expected the same issue here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I think from the designer, transient works fine. This is at least what I experienced.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just in the extension methods then.
Yeah, probably.
In the reflection of the attributes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. Yeah, if you want to create an issue, that will be good.
Yeah, okay, I will do that.
Thank you. All right, that's this one. So I am out of time, so maybe we can pick this one up next week.
Yeah, that works for me. Then I will prepare it a little bit better, and we'll go through the examples that I discovered that could yield some problems, and then we can finalize it.
Yeah, perfect. Great. All right, then, yeah, as I said, I gotta go, but let's reconvene next week. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.